For several months now, many of you have contacted me either on YouTube or Patreon asking me for my opinion on the CAS report, which is the colloquial term for the Independent Review of Gender Identity Services for Children and Young People, commissioned by the UK's National Health Services in order to guide their recommendations for kids who want gender-affirming care. We call it the Cass Report because it was led by Hilary Cass, a past president of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. The Cass Report took several years to compile, and the final version was published in April of this year. But prior to that, they had already released some preliminary findings, which the NHS has already used to guide some of their decision-making, like their decision to stop the use of puberty blockers in kids with gender dysphoria. And that's quite surprising, that the conclusions of the seemingly very detailed, nearly 400-page document was to recommend the exact opposite of the current standards recommended by organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, and every other major medical organization in the United States. Because the Cass report recommended psychiatric care instead of medical interventions for kids with gender dysphoria, it was largely embraced by transphobes around the world who cited it as proof that treating kids with gender dysphoria medically is ultimately some kind of child abuse. And because I've talked in the past about the pretty solid scientific basis for the current consensus that gender-affirming care is good, actually, a lot of you were wondering if this report changed my mind. And I'll be honest, when I first heard about the Cass report, I definitely thought it was compelling. Yes, it ended up going against the existing scientific consensus, but it was coming from within the medical establishment, at least. I always say that if you're going to overturn established science, you'd better be working within the field that you're planning to disrupt. Also, that scientific consensus isn't as solidified as it is in other fields for other topics, like evolution and climate change. These are topics that have had many years to collect a lot of data supporting them. The way experts treat kids with gender dysphoria is still an emerging field, and it's not completely bonkers to imagine that new research might adjust the way the consensus leads. So I decided to read the report for myself. It is available in full online, which you gotta love. And while it presents its findings as unbiased, it explicitly says it's not about rolling back people's rights to health care. That opening actually raised a little red flag for me, because why would that even need to be said? Oh, because, that's exactly what it has already led to with those preliminary findings, is the rolling back of some people's access to gender-affirming care. Another big red flag for me was that the report claims that their systematic overview found little to no evidence for the benefit of puberty blockers, but they recommend a purely psychological approach instead, which has no evidence of benefit either. Not in this report, and not in the past few centuries of attempting to treat gender dysphoria with therapy. In fact, in point 11.8 on page 158, the report reads, "The University of York concluded that there is limited research evaluating outcomes of psychosocial interventions for children and adolescents experiencing gender incongruence, and low quality and inadequate reporting of the studies identified. Therefore, firm conclusions about their effects cannot be made." Now, that's far less of a recommendation than the same report's summary on puberty blockers, which reads, "In summary, there seems to be a very narrow indication for the use of puberty blockers in birth-registered males as the start of a medical transition pathway in order to stop irreversible pubertal changes. Other indications remain unproven at this time." Okay, so if puberty blockers have some use cases according to their review, but psychological treatment alone has none, why are we recommending the latter and banning the former? The math just ain't mathin' for me. Despite those red flags, I still didn't make a video about that report. Well, why is that? Simple. It's not my area of expertise. I am not a doctor researching gender-affirming care, nor am I a statistical analyst who can easily look at a systematic review like this and say, oh, they shouldn't have used that regression, or they failed to properly weigh these studies. Also, not for nothing, but the thing is 388 pages. I do not have the attention span to be sure that I wasn't missing something. So I just cooled my heels and waited for the people who do have that expertise to weigh in. And they have. So I've decided it's finally time to talk about what the pushback on the Cass report has been. First up, way back in March, I noticed the Cass review, Cis Supremacy and the UK's Approach to Healthcare for Trans Children by Cal Horton from Oxford. In that piece, published in the International Journal of Transgender Health, Horton argues that the report is inherently and blatantly biased, framed in a way that ignores transphobia and accepts ideas like there is no such thing as a trans child as a valid professional viewpoint and not a sign of deep prejudice. That article is available online in full, and I do encourage you to read it. It's very interesting. As always, links to everything I talk about are in the transcript, which is linked in the description box doobly-doo thing. Which I don't know, is it over here? Is it down there? YouTube changes it up sometimes. You'll find it, I trust you. But while I found that paper interesting, it wasn't as hardcore of an investigation as I was interested in. So I was pleased to recently see Biological and Psychosocial Evidence in the Cass Review, a critical commentary, published just this month in that same journal. In this dissection, Dori M. Greisels of the Max Planck Institute for Brain Research reveals some telling mistakes that I certainly never would have caught. Again, that paper is in full online, and I recommend you read it all if you're interested. I'll just give you a few examples. For instance, one large section of the Cass report argues for the frequency of mental disorders in young people seeking care. And to support that, Cass cites one study that reported data separately for 2012 and 2015 and demonstrated an increase in autism rates from 1.8% to 15.1%. But the study actually showed a non-significant increase from 13.8% to 15.1%. Just kind of dropped a little 3 there. Whoops. That's just one very easy, simple to understand example out of several that Greisels points out in which Cass misrepresents or changes data from the studies that she claims to cite. The problems don't end with the studies Cass cites because, as you know, systematic reviews and meta-analyses are also about what studies are not cited. So here's one example of that. In point 8.14, the review cites Karamanis et al. As a large register-based population study to show that trans identity is mainly determined by environmental factors rather than having a genetic basis. However, this study included only 67 twins, and as such is much smaller than the numerous other studies which did find support for heritability of trans identity. The review does not discuss or cite any of these other studies or explain why the Karamanis study was determined to be the most relevant. The review argues that this study gives more credence to the idea of sex hormone exposure in the womb causing gender dysphoria. However, given the numerous contradictory findings in the literature, this single study does not provide sufficient evidence to give due credence. Greisels also addresses the weighting of the studies Cass does cite and the prioritizing of certain data from those studies over other data from the same studies. For instance, in discussing 4 studies on suicidality, 3 of them found that hormone treatments reduce suicidality, but Cass concluded that this evidence was too inconsistent and thus no benefit can be confirmed. Meanwhile, the report itself claims that evidence to date suggests that puberty blockers don't lead to substantially reduced adult height in transgender females. But just 1 page later, Cass concludes that blockers present this scary risk. Height gain may lag behind that seen in other adolescents. She consistently downplays any evidence of benefits while highlighting risks that aren't really risks. Now, if you read through Greisels' paper, you might get to the end and think, wow, that's a lot of mistakes. I guess that means the Cass report is dead. I mean, you would think that if you've never once interacted with the rabid anti-science transphobic mob, because no, they're going to be propping this up for years, which is why I'm grateful that the actual experts on this topic are going to just keep on kicking the Cass report while it's down. Guy Sales has joined forces with an international team of doctors and psychologists and gender and sexuality researchers, like some kind of queer Avengers, to publish another paper currently in preprint but available in full online, and it is even more damning. In critically appraising the Cass report, methodological flaws and unsupported claims, the researchers don't just point out the bias choosing and weighing of studies and the unfounded conclusions, but they actually use the risk of bias tool recommended by Cochrane, which, as you may know, is like the king of systematic reviews, to see if there's an objective measure of whether or not Cass was unfairly biased against trans care. And sure enough, they identified a high risk of bias in each of the systematic reviews, driven by unexplained protocol deviations, ambiguous eligibility criteria, inadequate study identification, and the failure to integrate consideration of these limitations into the conclusions derived from the evidence syntheses. We also identified potential sources of bias and unsubstantiated claims in the primary research that suggest a double standard in the quality of evidence produced for the Cass report compared to quality appraisal in the systematic reviews. Now, if you're wondering why a systematic review this biased and poorly edited would be written, accepted, published, and used to guide public policy, I recommend this article from Mother Jones, published back in May, that summarizes what we now know about the making of the Cass report. For instance, the report fails to reveal everyone who collaborated on it, but a blogger discovered that representatives from the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, which the Southern Poverty Law Center has dubbed the hub of the anti-LGBT pseudoscience network, were apparently members of the NHS Working Group on Gender Dysphoria. And Zinnia Jones found court documents showing that Cass herself met with Patrick Hunter, a DeSantis appointee to the Florida Board of Medicine, a member of SEGM, and big proponent of banning gender-affirming medical care for transgender youth. Hunter sent Cass materials from Florida's thoroughly discredited 2022 review of gender medicine, and then they became best buddies, and weird, both of their reports ended up with the same conclusions. Now, I left all of this info till the end of this video because I didn't want you to cry that I'm poisoning the well or ad hominem. The Cass report isn't wrong because of the fact that Cass colluded with pseudoscientific transphobes. It's wrong because it mischaracterizes the science in a multitude of ways that actual experts have deconstructed repeatedly now. The pseudoscientific transphobic collusion is just a hint as to why the report ended up this way. I'll be interested to see if the Cass report gets edited to fix any of the problems brought up, even the very basic ones like deleting a number to turn an insignificant increase in autism rates into an extremely significant one. There's not much they can do about the rampant bias, but a defense would certainly be interesting at this point. You know, it's a total coincidence, but the last few times that I've put out a video defending the consensus on medical treatment of children and young people with gender dysphoria, I've been on vacation at the time that the video goes public. And I always come home like a week later, you know, from being like off the internet. And I just have this litany of angry replies from TERFs and other transphobes who are angry that I'm not responding to them. And they're assuming it's because like I'm disrespecting them and not because, you know, I was relaxing on a beach somewhere. But this time, for the first time, I actually do not have a vacation scheduled. I'll be home when this video goes live. So I just want the transphobes to know that this time I'm not replying to you because I don't respect you, not because I'm on the beach. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.